The woods of Maine do not care about your intentions. They do not care about your dreams or the miles you have spent breaking in your boots. Up there in the high country of Franklin County, the wilderness is a thick and suffocating thing. They call the Appalachian Trail the Green Tunnel for a reason. It is a world of filtered emerald light where the horizon is stolen by the canopy, and the floor is a deceptive layer of moss and rot. People go in thinking they are finding themselves, but the forest is much better at losing people than they are at finding anything. It is a place of ancient granite and spruce that grows so tight you can barely shove a hand through the branches. When the fog rolls in off the Atlantic and gets trapped in those valleys, it turns the world into a grey smear where direction becomes a memory. This is where we find ourselves looking back at the summer of 2013, a year that left a scar on the trail that still hasn't faded. Western Maine is dominated by the mountains. Mount Abraham and the Saddleback Range stand like jagged teeth biting into the sky. It is beautiful in a way that feels threatening. Below those peaks lies the Redington Township. It is a rugged expanse of land that even the most seasoned woodsmen treat with a quiet kind of respect. To make matters more unsettling, there is a United States Navy survival school right in the middle of that wilderness. The sailors call it SARI School. Survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. They train men to vanish into the brush and live off the land while being hunted. It tells you something about the terrain when the military picks it specifically because it is a nightmare to navigate. The trees are a wall of balsam, fir, and black spruce. The ground is a sponge of peat and hidden crevices. If you step 6 feet off the beaten path, you might as well be on the moon. Geraldine Largay was 66 years old when she stepped into that green cathedral. Most people knew her as Jerry. On the trail, her name was Inchworm. It was a fitting title for a woman who moved with a slow and steady determination. She was not a marathon runner or a survivalist. She was a retired nurse from Tennessee with a soft smile and a husband who supported her every step of the way. Jerry had a dream of hiking the entire Appalachian Trail. It is a 2,000-mile pilgrimage that breaks younger and stronger people every single day. She had already hiked hundreds of miles through the southern heat and the rocky mid-Atlantic states. She was experienced enough to know the risks, but perhaps not cynical enough to fear the silence of the Maine woods. She had a hiking partner named Jane for a long time, but by the time they hit the rugged terrain of Maine, Jane had to leave due to a family emergency. Jerry decided to push on alone. She was well-equipped. She had a high-quality tent and a bright red fleece. She had a cell phone and a satellite beacon device, although she was not always comfortable with the technology. Her husband George would meet her at various trail crossings to resupply her and give her a night in a hotel room to scrub the trail grime away. They were a team. On the morning of July 22, 2013, Jerry left her husband at the Sandy River crossing. She was headed north toward the Poplar Ridge lean-to. It was supposed to be a short hike, then 10 miles. In the world of hiking, that is a light day. But the Maine miles are heavy. They are vertical and slick with mud. The air that morning was thick with humidity and the promise of rain. She waved goodbye to George and disappeared into the trees. She was never seen alive again. The hike from Route 15 toward the Poplar Ridge shelter involves a steady climb. You are gaining elevation while dodging roots that want to snap your ankles. Jerry was moving well. She actually ran into other hikers that morning. They remember her. They remember her smile and her gear. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. But somewhere between the crossing and the shelter, something shifted. It was a mundane moment. She needed to relieve herself. In the dense brush of the North Woods, you cannot just stand on the trail. You step off. You look for a bit of privacy behind a thicket of spruce. You take 10 steps, then 20. You do your business and you turn around to head back. But in the green tunnel, the back of one tree looks exactly like the front of the next. The trail is a thin brown line in a world of infinite green shadows. Jerry turned the wrong way. Within minutes, the silence of the woods began to feel heavy. When you realize you are lost, your heart starts to do a frantic dance against your ribs. The air feels thinner. Jerry tried to find her way back, but every step deeper into the woods made the trail a ghost. She pulled out her cell phone. She tried to text George. The message she typed out is enough to make the blood run cold. It said that she was in trouble and she had become lost off the trail. She asked him to call the mountain rescue, but the signal bars on her screen remained at 0. The Maine woods are a dead zone. The message hung in the digital void of her phone, unsent and unheard. She kept moving. That is the first mistake everyone makes. They keep moving, thinking the next ridge will look familiar. Instead, she descended into a valley that the sun rarely touched. By the time George realized she was not coming to the meeting point the next day, the machinery of a massive search began to groan into life. This was not a small effort. This was one of the largest search and rescue operations in the history of the state of Maine. They had hundreds of volunteers. They had dogs that could smell a dead leaf under a foot of snow. They had helicopters with thermal imaging cameras that can spot the heat of a field mouse from 1,000 feet up. They scoured the area around the trail. They pushed through the thickets where the spruce needles tear at your clothes like cat's claws. They called her name until their voices were hoarse. And they found nothing. Not a candy wrapper. Not a footprint. Not a single thread from that bright red fleece. It was as if Geraldine Largay had simply evaporated into the humid July air. The search lasted for weeks. The investigators were baffled. How does a 66-year-old woman with a heavy pack and a bright tent vanish in a zone that is being combed by professionals? There were whispers about the nearby Navy base. People wondered if she had wandered onto restricted land and been intercepted. Others looked at the terrain and simply shook their heads. The woods are deep, and they are hungry. Eventually the drones went home and the volunteers went back to their lives. The case went cold. George Largay was left with a hole in his life that no amount of mourning could fill. 2 years passed. 2 years of winters and springs and the slow rot of the forest floor. In October of 2015, a film crew working on a project for the Navy Survival School stumbled upon a site. They were in a remote area about 2 miles from the Appalachian Trail. It was a spot that had been marked as searched by the teams 2 years prior. What they found was a scene of quiet horror. They found a tent. It was collapsed and covered in forest debris, but it was there. Inside the tent, tucked neatly into her sleeping bag, were the remains of Geraldine Largay. She had not died from a fall. She had not been taken by a predator. She had simply sat down and waited. She had survived for 26 days in that spot. 26 days of watching the sun move across the canopy and listening to the sounds of the searchers in the distance. She had kept a diary. She had written notes to her family telling them how much she loved them and asking whoever found her to please tell them the truth of her end. The autopsy showed she died of starvation and exposure. But the questions that remain are more haunting than the answers. She was less than 2 miles from the trail. She had a space blanket set up to reflect light. She had tried to start fires. The search teams had passed within a few hundred yards of her location multiple times. The dogs had been in the area. The thermal cameras had flown overhead. Yet she remained invisible. It is as if the forest had folded over her, creating a pocket of reality where sound and light and heat could not escape. She sat in that tent for nearly a month, watching the world move on without her while she slowly faded into the dirt. It is a story of incredible resilience and a terrifying failure of our ability to perceive the things right in front of us. The case of Geraldine Largay is a grim reminder that the wilderness is not a park. It is a complex and often malevolent entity that follows its own rules. Her disappearance fits a chilling pattern we see time and again in the high country. The sheer proximity to the trail and the failure of high-tech search equipment suggests something more than just bad luck. It reminds me of the disappearance of Jared Atadero in the Rocky Mountains, who vanished in an area that had been cleared by dozens of people only for his remains to appear years later in a spot that defied logic. It echoes the case of Danny Philippidis, who went missing from a ski resort in New York only to turn up 6 days later in California with no memory of how he got there. There is a thinness to the world in these places. Geraldine stepped through a crack in the green tunnel, and by the time the world found the opening again, she was gone. The woods of Maine are silent now, but they remember the Inchworm. They remember the woman who sat in the dark and waited for a rescue that was only a few hundred yards away but a lifetime out of reach. The search had gone cold long before the forest finally decided to give back what it had taken. It was 2015 when a surveyor stumbled upon the site. A place where the shadows seemed a little too thick and the air carried the heavy scent of old, damp and forgotten things. The tent was a crumpled ghost of nylon and mesh, collapsed under the weight of autumn leaves and the relentless creep of the forest floor. It was a burial shroud, made of sporting goods. When they peeled back the fabric, they found her. Geraldine Largay was still there, tucked into her sleeping bag, as if she were simply waiting for the sun to rise on a morning that never came. She had not been torn apart by the black bears that roamed the Maine wilderness. She had not tumbled down a granite shelf or drowned in a sudden swell of the Redington stream. She had simply sat down and waited for the world to find her, For 26 days, Geraldine existed in a state of suspended animation while the machinery of a modern search and rescue operation ground gears all around her. 26 days of watching the light filter through the canopy, listening to the wind rattle the spruce needles, and hearing the distant, muffled shouts of men who were looking for a woman they could not see. The diary she left behind is a catalogue of a slow and quiet vanishing. She wrote notes to her family, words of love etched into paper that was slowly softening from the humidity of the woods. She asked whoever found her to tell her husband and her daughter the truth of her end. She was documenting her own erasure from the map. It is one thing to die suddenly in the wild. It is quite another to sit in the dark for nearly a month, watching your own body turn into a skeletal frame while the voices of your rescuers drift through the trees like mocking spirits. The autopsy confirmed the inevitable: starvation and exposure. But the medical report cannot explain the spatial anomaly of her location. Geraldine was found less than 2 miles from the Appalachian Trail. She was not in some deep, inaccessible canyon or hidden in a cave. She was right there. She had her space blanket spread out, a bright silver beacon intended to catch the eye of a pilot or a hiker. She had tried to start signal fires, small desperate flickers of orange against the oppressive green. Search teams had passed within a few hundred yards of her tent multiple times. The dogs had been in that very grid. The thermal cameras had scanned the area from the belly of a helicopter, searching for the heat signature of a living soul. Yet she remained invisible. It is as if the forest had folded over her, creating a pocket of reality where sound and light and heat could not escape. We like to think of the woods as a collection of trees and dirt, but cases like this suggest something more predatory. It is as if the landscape itself has a will, a desire to claim certain individuals and hold them in a blind spot of human perception. She sat in that tent for a month while the world moved on without her, fading into the loam until she was just another piece of the forest floor. The case of the woman they called Inchworm is a grim reminder that the wilderness is not a park for our recreation. It is a complex and often malevolent entity that follows rules we do not understand. Her disappearance fits a chilling pattern we see time and again in the high country. The sheer proximity to the trail and the total failure of high-tech search equipment suggests something more than just bad luck. There is a thinness to the world in these places, a place where the frequency of our reality shifts just enough to make us vanish while we are still standing right in front of each other. Geraldine stepped through a crack in the green tunnel, and by the time the world found the opening again, she was gone. The woods of Maine are silent now, but they remember the woman who sat in the dark and waited for a rescue that was only a few hundred yards away but a lifetime out of reach. The trees do not care about your global positioning systems or your satellite phones. They only care about the silence. And in the end, the silence always wins. This unsettling phenomenon brings to mind the case of young Jared Atadero, who vanished in the rugged terrain of the Rocky Mountains in 1999. The boy disappeared while walking just ahead of a group on a well-traveled trail, only for his clothing, and remains to be found several years later in a steep, high-altitude area that searchers had cleared multiple times. Much like the Inchworm, the physical evidence appeared in a location that defied the logic of the initial search and the capabilities of a small child. These cases suggest that once the wilderness decides to hide you, no amount of human effort can bring you back until the forest is finished with you.